Well, good evening, brethren. Here we are on our 13th study on the book of Revelation. And to start, let's do a brief introduction of some of the things we have covered. In the first chapter, we saw that this is the revelation of Jesus Christ that the Father gave him. And in verse 10 of the first chapter, talks about that John, the apostle John, was in a vision in spirit. It was a vision, therefore, of the day of the Lord. We also see in Joel chapter 2, verse 31, a little bit about what the day of the Lord is, because before the day of the Lord, there's the heavenly signs, which we will talk more about that in another day. Because we're going to talk quite a bit about that. But then there in chapter 1, we see Jesus Christ in his glory, and he's standing in the midst of the 7 lampstands, which are the 7 churches, and particularly referring there to the 7 eras and the 7 types of attitudes. So then in chapter 2 and 3, we see the letters that Christ wrote to the churches with messages of encouragement as well as warnings to the angels, which is the messengers, which we explained being the leadership or the leaders in those church eras. So Christ was giving words of encouragement to the leadership, but it also has those messages are applicable to all of us, because it's possible attitudes that any of us can be in one of those type of attitudes. Then in Revelation 4 and 5, we saw a scene before the throne of God in which angelic beings of great authority are there worshiping God. Then God gives the scroll with the 7 seals to Christ, who is the only one worthy to take the scroll and open the seals. Then in the last session, we started with Revelation 6, and we gave a little bit of background into there. We're going to today cover the first 4 seals, which is basically the 4 horsemen, and we're going to put that into context with the book of Daniel. So we're going to put a further context into the book of Daniel today as well. We did that in the last study as well. Some introductory context, we're going to cover a bit more on that. And then from Revelation chapter 7 onwards, it's events of the 7th seal, which is basically events after the 6th seal, but preceding the 7th seal and onwards, which is basically events of the day of the Lord, which actually is the focus of the book of Revelation. That's why we see at the top, Revelation 1 verse 10, it's a vision in spirit of the day of the Lord. And that is, think about it, the theme of the book of Revelation is to tell us events around the day of the Lord, which is that last year. And to build up to that, we had this introduction up to here, and throughout the explanation of events during the day of the Lord, it brings in certain things. And by the way, about this, or let me tell you a little bit more about this. So we've got what we call the inset chapters that bring back other events up, so that the story or the building up to the day of the Lord, which ends up finally with the coming of Jesus Christ and the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth, that is basically the bulk of the book of Revelation. And then the last 2 chapters or so is events very briefly after and beyond. So that is a summary of the whole book of Revelation, very, very briefly. Now, we spent a little time in the last study talking about the reign of Gentile kingdoms. We also discussed that the image of Daniel 2 is very important for us to have, let's call it a correct framework, to hang in other or to position other end time, I beg your pardon, to position other end time prophecies. Now, without this framework or this overview, this skeleton, which Daniel 2 gives us very briefly, without that, we can easily be misguided into many incorrect interpretations of biblical prophecies. In the last study, I also mentioned it's not just that, but it's also the understanding of who is Israel and who are the different tribes of Israel, particularly who is Judah and who is Ephraim and Manasseh as leading tribes or nations today of prophetic import. So Daniel 2, which is this framework of Gentile kingdoms, which basically cover from the time that Judah was taken into captivity until Christ's return. So this, in a sense, is this time of the Gentile kingdoms. And Daniel 2 is the very basic skeleton. Then there are additional details added to Daniel 2 in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. So those give us a very solid basis for us to understand the two beasts of Revelation 13 and the woman of Revelation 17. If we don't have those basic infrastructures of Daniel, starting on Daniel 2 and then plugged in with additional information on Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, if we don't have those, then we don't come to the right conclusions of the two beasts in Revelation 13, because there are two beasts in Revelation 13, and the woman, the harlot, in Revelation 17. Therefore, these events must fit into the overall framework or this image of Daniel 2. Namely, the prophetic beast must follow the actual sequence of Daniel 2 image. And any other person, and I've talked to many people with ideas, well, the beast is this nation, and because it's this nation because of this, and and they've got excellent human reasoning to say this makes sense and that makes sense, and therefore the beast is that nation. Well, it doesn't fit with the prophetic framework of Daniel. And if it doesn't fit with that, you are rejected, because the whole Bible hangs together as one unit. So that is important to understand that. So any clever reasoning about who's the beast can be discarded if we keep this in mind. So that's why I'm going through this very carefully, because there's going to be a lot of people saying different things about who's the beast, who's the image of the beast, what is the image of the beast, what is the mark of the beast, and all these things. And if we don't have these basics, you're going to be misled. Likewise, the false prophet, which is the second beast of Revelation 13, must also fit the prophetic details of Daniel 7, because Daniel 7 fits into Daniel 2, but Daniel 7 then brings in the false prophet. And so those are important things to keep in mind as we look at it. So Daniel 2 is directly related with Daniel 7. we've got this chart of prophecies of the reign of Gentile kingdoms, which I have shown to you before. I'm just revealing a little bit here. I'll reveal a little bit more later, and you will see the whole chart later. And as a handout, I will put on the website the full chart so that you can actually have a reference. This chart originally came out in an old booklet called Who's the Beast? And quite often is referred to amongst people in the church as the Beast chart, the Beast chart. But it actually is entitled A Chart Showing Prophecies of the Reign of Gentile Kingdoms. So in this chart, we can see that Daniel 2 is related to Daniel 7. And we can see these relationships here in these sections. The first one is Daniel chapter 7, verse 1 to 4, which talks about a beast, which is a lion, and that is directly related to the head of gold in Daniel 2. Then we see in Daniel 7, verse 5, talks about the bear, which is directly related with the chest and arms of silver. Now, how do we know that is also, how do we see that? It's because that ties in very nicely with Daniel 8, and Daniel 8 clearly identifies who is this ram. It's clearly identified who that is. And then as we get on to the next one, which is in Revelation 7, verse 6, which we have this third beast, which is a leopard, which has got 4 heads, and that is directly related in first place with the belly and thighs of bronze, of brass or bronze, which is the leopard. So those are directly related, and also it's directly related and clearly identified in Daniel 8, because it talks about the he-goat, because the he-goat goes against the ram, and as we know, the leopard takes over the reign from the bear, which basically it's that taking over one kingdom from the other. And so that follows there. So we have Babylon, and then we have Media and Persia, and then we have Greece. And then there's the 4 notable ones, because Alexander the Great then lost a very short time. Yes, he overtook and won. He won a lot of territory and lands very quickly, but then he died, and then his kingdom was divided into 4 notable ones, which are these 4 heads of the leopard, okay, which is defined as the belly and thighs of bronze or brass. So, there is a direct correlation identifying who these nations are. Then subsequently, we have interesting to note up to this stage that, as I mentioned, the leopard has 4 heads. And so if you count the 4 heads of the leopard, plus 1 of the bear, plus 1 of the lion, what do we got? 4, 5, 6 heads. So we got a total of 6 heads. Then after that, we have the 4th beast, which is a terrible one, which now is the 7th head, because we had 6 up to here. So it's the 7th head. And this beast, it's a terrible looking beast. It's strong like iron. And identifying it, who it is, because these are the legs of iron. And it has 10 horns. So now, this we can see that Daniel 7 image identifies who these are, and that is correlated with Daniel 8. So these 3 fit together, and it is important to understand it. Then we've got the 10 horns, which are the 10 resurrections of this kingdom, that one comes and then disappears, then the next one comes and disappears, and so on. All right? And that, those of Revelation 7, which is the head with 10 horns, we've seen here that the beast has 7 heads, and then there's the 10 horns. Yeah, we only have 3. I'll show you later in another slide this whole picture. But here is the 10 horns which follow up. Now, in Revelation 13, verse 1, in Revelation 13, verse 1, we see a beast, right, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. So this beast is the sum of, which is this beast, yeah, the legs of iron, but it's got 7 heads because it's all these heads. So it's the outcome of what is proceeded with those. So there we have the 7 heads and the 10 horns. So we take this directly related, Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, and then we can see in Revelation 13 who that is. So the other thing is Daniel's 2 image has 2 legs, right? One is the east and the other one is the west. The Roman Empire had 2, let's call divisions, the western and the eastern, the western part and the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And then we read in Revelation 13 that this beast had a mortal wound. So I want to read Revelation 13, and let's read there, starting in verse 1. Then I stood by the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. We will go through this in more detail. In other words, we'll go through Revelation 13 in more detail when we get to that chapter. So we're not at this stage going through Revelation 13 in detail, but we are just correlating it or relating Revelation 13 with Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. So we're just putting them together. So he says here they have 7 heads and 10 horns. And on his horns were 10 crowns, so it's 10 kings. And on his heads, a blasphemous name. So we have this Roman government, which had a blasphemous name because, you know, the people worshipped the emperors. So there was blasphemy there. Now, the beast which I saw was like a leopard. See, like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. So we can see this beast with 7 heads as a little bit of the leopard, as a little bit of the bear, and as a bit of the lion. So it really ties these together. And basically, the point here is a leopard is very agile. So the feet were like the feet of a bear, very strong, part of the bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion, which is also a very strong part of the lion. So this beast was a terrible looking beast, and it was motivated by Satan, because it says the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. So this Roman Empire had power, special powers from Satan. And then look in verse 3, and I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. So it is a beast that has a mortal wound. So we've got here a deadly wound. So it is a case in which the Roman Empire, after many years, it ceases to continue. But then it was healed and came up again. And what we know that is it's the Holy Roman Empire, which was governed, in a sense, by the Catholic Church. And the whole world marveled and followed the beast. So this whole empires basically where the world has followed, and this will continue. Now, then we have here in Daniel 7. Now, I want to go to Daniel 7, verse 8. In Daniel 7, verse 8, so let's go to Daniel 7, verse 8. Because in Daniel 7, we see describing in verse 4, the lion, which is the Chaldean Empire or Babylon. In verse 5, talking about the bear, which was the Persian, Medo-Persians. In verse 6, talking about the leopard, which was Greece. And in verse 7 is the fourth beast, exceedingly strong, and a huge iron teeth, and it was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. So we can see, connecting again the iron to the legs of iron of Daniel 2, and also connected to Revelation 13, because it had a strength like iron as well. So, and then it says there it had 10 horns at the end of verse 7. So we can see in this Daniel 7, there is these 10 horns to follow up here, just like the beast in Revelation 13 has 10 horns. So the horns of Daniel 7 correlate directly with the horns of the first beast of Revelation 13. So they directly related. Right, now, what I wanted to come to here is verse 8. It says, I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little horn, a little one, coming amongst them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there, in this horn, were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. So we have this little horn here in Daniel 7 that comes up, and it plucks up these 3 that were before, which I talked about that in the last study, which were governments or kingdoms of Arianism, which were basically that believed that Jesus was Michael, and therefore was that concept. When the Catholic Church came, and this horn represents the Catholic Church, this horn then pulled that out or rooted it out, because they drove a different belief, which is a belief of Trinity. So they completely pulled that out. Now, this little horn appears, and it will ride the beast with the deadly wound, in which was healed. We will look a little bit more about that, but we read in Revelation 13, verse 3, that he had a deadly wound, and it was healed. And it's going to ride that. And who it rides, we know through history, was the western part of the empire, not the eastern part, was the western part of this Roman Empire. Therefore, what we need to follow is the western part of the Roman Empire, not the eastern leg. So that is important at this stage to keep in mind. While we're doing Revelation chapter 7, let's also read verse 20 and 22. Because in verse 22, it says, and the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn, that's that little horn, which came up, before which 3 fell. So the 10 horns that are here, which is the state, which is the government, and the little horn, which is the church, as we can see here in the chart, is the church, the little horn. Continue here. which came up, before which three fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth that spoke pompous words. That's this little horn. That is the Catholic Church, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. Yeah, greater or more pompous, because it was a church, was a religion, and people were following it like a religion. And verse 21, I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints. The Catholic Church, since it became established and powerful around this time, which from was from the year 325 AD 325, when was the Council of Laodicea. From there onwards, they persecuted the church for 1260 years. And it will do that again. And it says, and making war against the saints and prevailing against them. Yeah, during those 1260 years, it prevailed against them. And when it does it again, which will be during the time of the Great Tribulation, it will prevail against the saints again. And this is until, verse 22, until the Ancient of Days came, that's the Father, and judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High. So God the Father gave the instruction to Jesus Christ to come back to earth. So until the Ancient of Days gave that instruction in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom, which is when Christ comes back. Obviously, as we see, when God gives the instruction to do, that's why Christ said, no man knows the day or the hour of his coming but the Father, because when the Father decides now is the time, that's it. So, and then Christ will come and the saints will possess the kingdom. Will possess what? The kingdom of God, and it will reign on earth. The kingdom of God will reign on earth. Now, we'll continue reading in Daniel 7, verse 24, because this is very important. And it says, the 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom. From this kingdom. So these horns, which are resurrections, that come from this kingdom, which is from this kingdom. So it's resurrections that will succeed from this Roman-based empire, the Western leg. They'll come from this, and it will arise from this kingdom. Continue at verse 25 through 20. Continue the rest of verse 24. And he said, and another shall rise after them, and shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue the 3 kings. That's the little horn. And verse 25. And he shall speak pompous words. In other words, it's a religious entity against the Most High. Shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Now, this is very important to understand that. Then the saints shall be given into his hand. The saints will be given into the hand of this little horn, of this false prophet at the end time, for a time, times, and half a time. And this is dual. Time, times, and half a time. It's 3.5 years, but a day for a year. So that is, each year has got 360 days times 3 plus half a year. You get up to 1,260 years. A day for a year. And so that was one part of this prophetic fulfillment. The duality is that it will happen again during the time of the Great Tribulation for 3.5 years. So the first, let's call it wave, was during that time from 325 till about 1585. And the second time it will happen will be during the period of a Great Tribulation. But the first time, those times and alpha time will be in years, 1,260 years. And the second time it happens will be the Great Tribulation for a shorter period of 3.5 years. But now look at this point here that I want to highlight. He says, and he shall arise, and he says, he shall intend to change times and law. Did he do that? Yes, he did. How? Because at the Council of Nicaea, he did two things. He changed the Sabbath to Sunday, which means change the law, because the law says keep the Sabbath. He says, no, keep Sunday. And change times. What do you mean by change times? This section of Daniel from chapter 1 to chapter 7 was written in Aramaic. Not in Hebrew, in Aramaic. Times in Aramaic is a word called zeman, which means appointed times, which the word appointed times in other places in Hebrew is moedim, which is used for God's holy days or feast days. So you'll attempt to change or intend to change holidays, holy days. And hasn't that happened? Does the world today follow God's holy days or follow pagan holidays? And indeed, in the Council of Nicaea, they changed the keeping of the Passover from the 14th of Nisan to Easter Sunday, and which is still on today. So he has indeed done this intent to change times and law. If you go to the Catholic Church, the law of the Sabbath is not the fourth commandment. Did you know that? It's the third. Because they merged the first and the second commandment into one to hide the commandment about thou shalt not have images behind you shall only have one God. And then, yeah, they still say, but it's kind of the image is hidden behind we have one God. And then they say, well, the image is just to help you to communicate with God. So they changed the law, and they made the fourth commandment the third. And instead of the Sabbath, they say you keep Sunday. And the Catholic Church today still says we changed the Sabbath to Sunday. There's no biblical authority to change the Sabbath to Sunday, but the Pope has that authority. And they freely admit that. Then, for them to still have 10 commandments, then the last, the 10th commandment, they split it into two, because the 10th commandment, when it says thou shalt not lust, they split into two commandments. So the 9th commandment, according to the Catholics, you shall not lust. For instance, for the woman, I can't remember now which one it is first. And then the 10th one, you shall not lust physical things. So they've separated that into two. So they have changed the law. But the interesting point here, they changed times, which is God's holy days, and the law. So it really, historically, you can really know that we are, let's call it, tracking the right group, the right organization, the right government, state, and the right, or rather the correct ones that it's appointing here to church. We know that. There's no doubt about that. So what we have is Babylon represents the head of the image of Daniel 2. Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 then clearly identify a system that originated from Babylon that has persisted all the way to Rome. And this Roman government is what is going to be resurrected, because it's said from this kingdom, as I showed you in the previous slide. So it's from this same image, this same statue that is going to come, these feet and these 10 toes. Thus, the last beast, that's this, the one with 7 heads and 10 horns, is identified with an European Gentile kingdom. Why is European? Because the Rome went west and east. The west was in Europe, and the east was in Istanbul and Turkey and that. And that, the western is where the Catholic Church that persecuted the saints and all that was on the western leg. So, and also identifies the Church of Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, Roman Universal Church. So this system is both religious, government, and finances. And this financial and religious system continues till today. The government is, in a sense, going to be resurrected, but this financial and religious system is still living today. And it has a lasting impact as gold, because it's the head of gold and has a lasting impact as gold. So this Babylon, a mighty city, over her the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, because it's a business. It's a money-making business. Let's look at that in Revelation chapter 18, verse 11 through 13. It says, and the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her. That's when Babylon is destroyed, right at the end, at Christ, when Christ comes. It says, the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore, the merchandise of gold or silver, precious stones, etc., etc., etc. And look at the end of verse 13. It says, right at the end, which they dealt with all these things, and bodies and souls of men. Bodies and lives of men. And that means slavery and make business with people, buying and selling people. It is a little known reality or fact that trade of human beings, of slavery, is a huge business today, because the society of Babylon exists. So this religious and financial system has occurred throughout all this time since Babylon, and during the Middle Ages has been the fuel for the European power over centuries that made Europe rich. You go to Europe and there is what they call old money that is really very powerful out there. So over the centuries, millions of people have died in Europe because of this Babylonian system, which has survived, and which means is a business over the bodies and souls of men. Yeah, they souls of men, basically they wanted their lives with their religion, and says, you got to have my religion, otherwise we'll kill you, and they have done business out of that. So and this system has survived, even if under different names. For instance, different false gods and pagan gods, and the different nations got different names, but it's the same root from Babylon. And this is existing until of recent times, and will soon revive with great power. Will soon revive again. So here we have the chart that I have been showing you, just the left part, The right-hand side of this chart, it's got then explanations of the symbols, which I went through, and the actual events fulfilled in history. So we know it is correct because these are the fulfillments, the evidence of these things happening and the different dates. And the deadly wound was the fall of the Roman Empire in the year 476. So that was long after the formation of the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church then took over and started getting involved with politics and took over the section of politics, and that is when the other kingdoms get established, which the Catholic Church controlled or ruled. Now, this is important. For instance, look at this historical event. The Vandals, the Heruli, and the Ostrogoths. It says these three horns, destroyed at the behest of the Pope, filled what they call the transition age. So, so there we have the historical events, and then this little horn that is of Daniel 7, which is the two-horned lamb dragon of Revelation 13, which is a scarlet woman of Revelation 17. So let's look at Revelation 13, verses 11 through 18. Revelation 13. Now, Revelation 13, there's basically two sections. Revelation 13, from verse 1 to verse 10, is one section. And Revelation 13, verse 11 through 18, is another section. So here we have Revelation 13, which has two sections. The first section is about a beast that rises up from the sea. Basically, the sea representing a turmoil of people. There is arguments, there is infighting, there's demonstrations, there is riots in the streets, and out of that sea, that turmoil of confusion, rises up a leader that becomes a government leader, or the beast. So, Revelation 13, verse 1 through 10 is something that is still to happen. That's this beast is going to rise up. But Revelation 11 through 18 is another beast. Look at it. Verse 11, then I saw another beast. You see, there's two beasts. There's the first beast, which is civil, which is a government, which is what we normally call the beast power. But then there's the second beast, in Revelation 13:11, which we normally talk about the false prophet. But it is another beast coming out of the earth. Now, the first beast, as you can see in verse 1, which is a government, comes out of the sea. And I explained the sea, turmoil and fights and riots and whatever it is, and great turmoil on earth, particularly around Europe, causes a leader to come up out of that. They're rejecting whatever is happening in the world. Maybe it's different political things. Maybe it's people from other nations coming into Europe. Maybe there's terrorism attacks. Maybe there's things because of illnesses, etc. It just causes a revolution. And out of that revolution, out of that sea of confusion, a leader comes up. And the other 10 leaders give the power to that leader. That is the beast. Revelation 13:1 through 10. But Revelation 13:11 is a second beast that comes out of the earth. Does not come out of the sea. Comes out of the earth. And coming out of the earth means It's already an established organization, and it just comes back to the fore. And that is a church which is existing, and it comes up to the front, to the scene of events. And so this it says, coming out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. A lamb dragon image, or this beast. And he says, and he exercises all the authority of the first beast, because the first beast is the government, and this church is working in conjunction with the government and the first beast. And he says, whose deadly wound was healed. So the second beast, in the book of Revelation, is a church that is going to rise up again. So we have is this woman, this lamb born, which in Revelation 18, Revelation 17 is talked about the great harlot who sits on many waters, which sits over these governments, over these nations, over these people. Okay? And it says, and I saw a woman, verse 3, Revelation 17, verse 3, a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. So it's this woman sitting on this church, this false prophet, right? Which is sitting on this beast, was full of names of blasphemy, with 7 heads and 10 horns. So this woman that rode the beast had 7 heads and 10 horns. And this is where people get confused. Because this woman is only going to ride after she gets into power and she starts controlling these governments. You see, the woman of Revelation 17 only rides the beast after she, the woman, appears. Of course. So now, let me look at the bottom part of the same chart. So we have here at the top, the same headings. So I included the headings there. And this is the last line that we were seeing in the previous slide. There's the scarlet woman that is riding this beast, as it says here, with 7 heads and 10 horns. Why 7 heads? Because in Revelation 13, these are defined as 10 horns, and 3 had been pulled out. So if 3 had been pulled out, there's only 7 remaining. And this woman only rides the beast from this moment onwards. So these seven remaining horns of this beast of Revelation 13, from verse 1 to verse 10, now in Revelation 17 is defined as heads. It's this beast that was healed, that is ridden by the scarlet woman, this great harlot. And so these are the different governments. And when the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy and the image of the beast is the government. You know, when it talks about there's an image of the beast, is that Roman government. And you know what? The authority, the leadership, the government authority within the Roman Catholic Church is a replica, is an image of the government authority of the Roman Empire. You look at the Catholic Church, it's got all these authorities and things like that, which is an image, which is a replica of that. And that is replicated practically in every country where the Roman Empire, where the Catholic Church is. Now, that then became a replica of the Roman government. That is the image of the beast. And the different heads, are the remaining horns. And in this chart explains who those, let's call it, Holy Roman Empire resurrections are. The first one was the imperial restoration by Justinian in 554. He was recognized the supremacy of the Pope, and he was put into place by the Pope. The next one was the Frankish kingdom, Charlemagne, crowned by the Pope. The second one was a German head, Otto the Great, so-called Holy Roman Empire. Otto the Great, crowned by the Pope, 962. The fourth head, which is the fourth of the remaining 7 horns here, as you can see, the fourth head is the Habsburg dynasty, the Austrian head, Charles the Great, crowned by the Pope. And the fifth head, ridden by the woman, was Napoleon's kingdom, with a French head, crowned by the Pope as well, 1805. So these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 resurrections were directly ridden by the church. That period from 554, when was the imperial restoration by Justinian, all the way to when was the end of the Napoleon's kingdom, all right, brings us to 1814, the year 1814. And that is exactly 1,260 years that the beast continued. So these 1,260 years of the beast power are not the same 1,260 years of the church persecuting true Christians, as I explained to you before. But they are also 1,260 years. After that, in 1814, just 1,260 years after the deadly wound was healed, the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved. And so closed the government that dated from Augustus Caesar. After that, it's kind of a hidden version of it that resurrected, but it was also, these leaders were also respected or endorsed by the Pope, but it was not the same level of this sixth head. And that's why it says one is. When you read it, Revelation 17, verse 10, it says, there are also 7 kings, 5 have fallen, one is, and the other has yet to come. The point that one is, I have a little asterisk here that ties in when it was understood. This was understood towards the end of the Second World War, when God revealed it to Mr. Armstrong. And we then understood at that time, one was indeed. It's not today, because that is down again. Now we're waiting one yet to come, which is going to be the revived Roman Empire, which is that 7th head with 10 horns. And who are the 10 horns? Are these 10 toes of Daniel 2. So these are the 10 toes, the 10 horns of Revelation 17. That is why it's important to put Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Revelation 13, and Revelation 17 together to fit it together. Because otherwise people say, oh no, it's something else. And then it doesn't fit. So it's like doing a puzzle. It only fits one way. And once it fits, it fits. That's it. And it fits. So that is important for us to understand. Right. So now, these sections here are all Roman Empire's resurrections. Because the Roman Empire itself has gone. You see? And that's why it says elsewhere, it says in verse 11 of Revelation 17, it says, and the beast that was and is not is himself also the eighth, and is of the seven. You see, this beast is of these seven, but is of the eighth because it is of that Roman Empire that has collapsed. So it says also it's also the eighth, but it's of these seven. This one that is to come, that one that is to come, right? The beast that was and is not, and is himself also the eighth, and is of the seven. So it's of these seven, but it's the eighth because it comes from the Roman Empire itself that had the deadly wound. So it all fits. It all fits. It's very important to see how it fits. So let us now go back to Revelation 6, verse 1, which is the white horse. Okay, we have seen in Matthew 24 that many will come in Christ's name. So obviously it represents false religion. We also see in Corinthians that disguise themselves as apostles of Christ. We also told that once one seal is open, it stays open till the end. So the rider has ridden this horse, the white horse, through the ages and will continue to ride until Satan is deposed. So this white horse, which represents the Catholic Church and its leader, will continue to ride until Satan is deposed. Then we saw in Daniel 7 that there was a little horn, which represents this false religion. And these pagan teachings have infiltrated the church at that time. Let's call the primitive church, the early church, the church of the apostles, from the beginning. As soon as Jesus found the church, there were people coming in and bringing in false doctrines. You read in Acts 20, when Paul was saying goodbye to the ministry in Ephesus, it says, from among you, very ministers will come deceivers. So Satan is very clever, and it even deceives elect, some of the elect. We got to be careful. So those pagan teachings filtered into the church and led to a split, a separation. So the early church did not accept this, like we read in Apocalypse chapter 2. The church in Ephesus did not accept them. They were rejected, and it caused that split separation. And that group that separated then became various groups, but a dominant one that then crystallized was the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church then got involved into politics with the Roman government, in the search for power and control. And that's what happened. And we saw the Pope get involved with that. And that was those resurrections that we see. The outcome was great persecution of Sabbath keepers and observers of the Passover, or Passover on the 14th. And we saw that from the Council of Nicaea all the way through for 1,260 years, from 325 till 1585. Then, because of that, there was religious wars. And you know what it is. Because of religious wars, there's famine, there's disease epidemics, there's death that followed for the next 1,260 years during the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages, they were very bad years. So this persecution of true Christians started abating with the Protestant Reformation, because it was the Catholic Church itself starting to have wars amongst themselves, and then became the Protestants, those that protested against their leadership. And this ultimately led to the formation of the New World, moving to the States, and hence we can see that these Protestant groups gave birth to the church's daughters, which is talked about in Revelation 17, verse 5, talks about, it says, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. Because harlots is because they're not following God's truth. So they're perverting God's truth. So they are committing harlotry with another God, which is Satan and his demons. So that is that paganism. So that's the white horse. Then we have in Revelation 6, verse 3 and 4, let's read. And then when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, come and see. And another horse, fiery red, that's the red horse, went out. And it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, that people should kill one another, and there was given to him a great sword. And that is tied in with Matthew 24, and it says, you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, in verse 6. See that you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. So when Jesus founded God's church, the Roman Empire at that time was experienced a brief period of peace. So God's word could initially go out. But then after that, we see that, like I said, once the seal is open, it remains open. These riders with their horses throughout the ages started riding. First the white horse, and then the red horse, which is wars which are tied to religion. A lot of wars have developed because of religion. You talk about the Crusades, you talk about a lot of others. It was religious based. So the final ending climax of war will be the battle of that great day of God Almighty. That is at Christ's coming. That will be when the nations will be gathered, as we read in Revelation 16, verse 14, and they'll be gathered for that war. In Revelation, it says, they are spirits of demons performing signs which go out to the kings of the earth, of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of the great day of God Almighty. And Revelation 19, verse 11 through 21, we can see that war because it's Christ coming out of heaven with his armies, and then there's that war, and you can see all the way through in verse 19 that it says, and I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him who sat on the horse and his army. And so it says, so they were killed. So that battle of the great day of the Lord is right at the end, when Christ comes and then establishes the kingdom of God. So that red horse, that seal of the red horse, which has been, in this meaning, unleashed by the white horse, but it is propagating all the way, which is religious wars, all the way till Christ's coming, which will be a religious war against Christ. And then the next one is in Revelation 6, verse 5 and 6. And then he opened the third seal, and I heard the third living creature say, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a black horse. And he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand, and I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." So that means food gets very expensive. So Matthew 24, verse 7, second part of verse 7 says, "And there'll be famines." So particularly as a consequence of religious persecution and wars. Yes, there'll be all types of wars, but that is particular because it is symbolic of this black horse. But there will obviously be other wars. There'll be other conflicts between people. There'll be conflicts between groups of people, between nations, dictatorships, discrimination against others due to what? Different ideas. What different ideas? Could be of different things. Could be of do this or don't do that. And people start dictating, do this or don't do that. And all beliefs or ethnic groups or religions. So we're going to have all these conflicts between people because of ideas or beliefs of ethnic groups or religions. And these things will cause destruction of assets, of properties, of cities. And that will disrupt agriculture production. And if it disrupts agriculture production, this disrupts cities and things like that, what happens? It disrupts the supply chain. And therefore, you don't get food. The supermarkets are empty. And this will lead to severe and widespread shortage of food and other basic necessities of life. That's the black horse. And you can see this horse is riding. Now, let's read verse 7 through 8 of Revelation 6. Then he opened the fourth seal, and I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come and see." And so I looked, and behold, a pale horse, like a pale greenish horse, like a sickly looking horse. And the name of him who sat on it was Death and Hades. Death and Hades. Death and graves. In other words, mass burials. You saw at the beginning of COVID, they were showing pictures where people were just digging graves and burying people. It was terrible. So yes, on him who sat on it was Death and Hades, followed with him. And power was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. So we tie that with Matthew 24, also another part, which is there will be pestilences and earthquakes in various places. Now I want you to note that the word earthquakes in Greek is the word seismos. Now interesting is the same word that is used in Matthew 8, verse 24. And verse 8:24 is when Christ is in a boat, and suddenly there was a great tempest arose on the sea, so the boat was covered with waves, but Christ was kind of fast asleep. And they woke him up and says, "Hey, wake up. There's a great tempest. There's a great storm out there." The word for tempest is the same Greek word, seismos. So seismos is a great seismographic change. Could be an earthquake, could be a storm, could be a tornado, could be a tsunami, any major change on the land or MS. So any major change or shake of the land that causes earthquakes and things like that, or volcanoes or things, tremors, shaking on the it's seismographic things, seismos, causing volcanoes. And it could be, for instance, even volcanoes underwater, as we saw recently near Tonga, and cause the tsunami. All these things are part of this pale horse. Pestilences and earthquakes. You see? And that causes death. Now, I want to emphasize an interesting point here in Revelation 6:8, the second part here. Because in Revelation 6, verse 8, halfway through it says, and power was given to them over the fourth of the earth. Who is them? You see, it's talking about the fourth horse. But now it says to them. Who is them? Because read a little bit more. Over the fourth of the earth to kill with sword, with anger, and with death. Who is them? With sword, is not that wars? With hunger, is not that famine? And with death, is not that pestilences and earthquakes? So it's like saying them being the red horse, the black horse, and the pale horse. And therefore, they'll kill with the sword, which is the red horse, with hunger, which is the black horse, and with death, which is the pale horse, and by the beasts of the earth. And by the beasts of the earth. And the beasts of the earth, which would cause pestilences, as we read in Matthew 24, verse 7, leading to death and the grave, Hades. The implication could be disease-bearing animals, such as mice or whatever it is, or even microscopic viruses, whether they are man-made or not. So this pale horse, which is diseases, which is death and graves, is pretty well identified, I think. So, as we see these ridings of these four horsemen, remember, the seals are open and they're riding in parallel, and they'll keep riding until Christ comes. What things do we watch? Matthew 24 tells us a few things to watch. It says this is the beginning of sorrows. And brethren, we are today living in the beginning of sorrows. Regrettably, it's going to get much worse. And many will be offended and will betray one another and hate one another. People are saying things that are unkind, that are offensive, that are not loving. People are beating one another with the tongue, with words. They're betraying one another, and they're not loving one another. And with all these things happening, many people are going to come out there and says, oh, therefore, this is the mark of the beast, or this is this, or the whatever, or the vaccine and getting a vaccine passport, or whatever they're going to call it, that's the mark of the beast. It's not. Many false prophets will rise up and will deceive many. And there'll be so many other weird ideas that are going to come up that I can't even think of. And have come up, and more will come up. And then says people, oh, got to prove that this is the case. Brethren, we need to look at the basics. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Revelation 13, Revelation 17. Put these things together and says, And then we look at the book of Revelation, we put it all together, and we identify exactly what is the image of the beast and what is the mark of the beast, clearly identify that, and then we don't get deceived. And with all these ideas, we throw them away and we reject them. Because all this is happening, people are just gonna get short and curt and sharp with one another because there's so many things going wrong. There's crime on the streets, more and more crime in the streets, and the love of many will grow cold. And we have to endure to the end, brethren. We have to endure till the end. In parallel, this gospel is being preached as a witness. That was not done during the Second World War. This gospel was not preached to the whole world before, but now is. Therefore, the next thing is, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in a holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. And so, there is a number of things that have to happen until we get to the abomination of desolation. Oh, what is the abomination of desolation? Well, it's something that is going to come up that will signal the beginning of the Great Tribulation. But before that, we have the unrolling of these 4 seals that we've seen and a number of things to watch. In the next Bible study, we're going to take it from here and study a little bit more to start moving onto the other seals. Because we talked about these first 4 seals, and we're going to talk about the other seals, and we'll look at this chart in more detail to start framing all this together in a clear, concise perspective so that we are not deceived. Thank you, brethren, and you all have a good evening.